Our speaker, war correspondent Chris Hedges, believes that despite war's devastating impact on life, community, and culture, we are drawn to the intoxication of violence. In his new book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, he explores the myth psychology behind war, dispelling the idea of war as being noble and heroic, and urges renewed compassion and peace. Chris Hedges has been a foreign correspondent for 15 years, covering wars around the globe. After reporting in Central America and the Middle East for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR, he joined the staff of the New York Times in 1990, going on to serve as Balkan Bureau Chief and Middle East Bureau Chief. Mr. Hedges was part of the New York Times team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. A graduate of Harvard University's School of Divinity, he is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Nieman Fellowship in 1998 and the 1999 Francis Frostwood Courage in Journalism Award. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Chris Hedges.
Thank you. I want to talk to you today about war, about the poison that war is, about how it infects individuals and societies, about the ways it perverts and destroys us, and about how, if we do not understand war and control it, it can end in our own destruction. Just as a cancer patient must ingest a poison to fight off the disease, so must we at times ingest the poison of war. But this poison, if we do not understand it and control it, can kill us just as effectively as the disease itself. I want to talk about the myth of war and the drug of war, for war is perhaps the most potent narcotic invented by humankind. It is a drug I ingested for many years, from the war in El Salvador, where I spent 5 years, to the Palestinian uprising, to the Persian Gulf War, where during the Shiite uprising in southern Iraq, I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard, to Algeria, the Sudan, Yemen, Bosnia, and Kosovo. War is something I know, and I pay for this, keeping the horror of it, the memories of it, wrapped in folds of protective cloth deep inside of me. I have seen too much of violent death, and these memories, when they rise to the surface, are burdens. I want to talk about the frightening, idolatrous belief in our own power and superiority as a nation. Our belief that we have a right to determine how others should live and how the world should function, about the imperial power we have become and the danger of this. War is a god, as the ancient Greeks and Romans knew, and its worship demands human sacrifice. War always begins by calling for the sacrifice of others, but it ends, if we do not understand war and control it, with our own self-sacrifice. Taste enough of war or any drug, and you come to believe the Stoics were right. We will all consume ourselves in a vast conflagration. The weapons of mass destruction we now possess, and those arrayed against us now hunger to possess, make their apocalyptic vision and ours a distinct possibility. We fight an amorphous, never-ending war on terror, one where we have falsely come to believe that if we can kill all terrorists, we can somehow rid the world of evil. This simple, deadly theology that we now embrace only mirrors the nihilistic vision of those that would like to rid the world of our presence. We have come to believe in the same way the doomed empires did at the end of the 19th century, that our military technology makes us invulnerable, that war can be waged, others can die, but for us it can be cost-free. We have come to believe that war is a spectator sport. This lie was perfected for us during the Persian Gulf War, when the military and the press presented war not for what it is, death, but as a vast video arcade game. Those that died, even our own, were nameless, faceless phantoms. War made us feel good, and because so many of us have lost touch with what war is, we allow the state now to wage it with barely a murmur of protest. And by the time we do understand, it may be too late. The seduction of war is insidious, because so much of what we are told about war is true. It does create a feeling of comradeship, which obliterates our alienation and makes us, for perhaps the only time in our life, think we belong. War allows us to rise above our small stations in life. We find nobility in the cause and feelings of selflessness, even bliss. And at a time of soaring deficits and financial scandals, of the very deterioration of our domestic fabric, war is a fine diversion. War itself has a dark beauty, filled with the monstrous and the grotesque. The Bible calls it the lust of the eye and warns believers against it. War gives us a distorted sense of self. It gives us meaning. And once in combat, the past and the future are obliterated. All is one heady, intoxicating present. You feel every heartbeat. Colors are brighter. Your mind races ahead of itself. You are aware in ways you never were before. War is Zen, and they do tell you this. This is not a lie. Moreover, war allows you to engage in lusts and passions you kept hidden in the deepest, most private interiors of your fantasy life. It allows you to destroy not only things, but human life. And in that moment of wholesale destruction, you feel the power of the divine, the power to revoke another person's charter to live on this earth. The frenzy of this destruction, and when unit discipline breaks down, or there was no unit discipline to begin with, frenzy is the right word, sees armed bands consumed and crazed by the poisonous elixir that our power to bring about the obliteration of others always brings. All things, including human beings, become objects in war, objects to either gratify or destroy or both. And almost no one is immune. The contagion of the crowd sees to that. Force, Simonville writes, is as pitiless to the man who possesses it, or thinks he does, as it is to its victims. The second it crushes, the first it intoxicates. Only when we are in the midst of conflict does the shallowness of much of our lives become apparent. Trivia dominates our conversations and increasingly our airwaves. And war is enticing. It gives us a resolve, a cause. And those who have the least meaning in their lives, the impoverished Palestinian refugees in Gaza, the disenfranchised North African immigrants in France, even the legions of lost youth that live in the splendid indolence and safety of the industrialized world, are all susceptible to war's appeal. I do not miss war, but I miss what it brought. I can never say I was happy in the midst of the fighting in El Salvador or Bosnia or Kosovo, but I had a sense of purpose, of calling, of meaning. And this is a quality war shares with love, for we are also able to choose fealty and self-sacrifice over security for those we love. The initial selflessness of war mirrors that of love, the chief emotion war ultimately destroys. And this is what war often looks and feels like at its inception, love. The ancient Greeks understood this strange attraction between love and death in wartime. When Achilles kills Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, in the Trojan War, he falls in love with her as she expires on the battlefield. He murders love. There are those who will insist that the comradeship of war is love, that the ecstatic glow that makes us feel in war as one people, one entity, is real. But this is part of war's intoxication. The danger, the external threat that comes when we have an enemy does not create friendship. It creates comradeship. In wartime, for perhaps the first and only time in our lives, we no longer face death alone. We face death as a group, and because of this, death is easier to bear. And those in wartime, just as those who live through danger and trial as a group, are deceived in comradeship about what they are undergoing. This is why once the war ends, once the period of trial is over, these comrades again become strangers to us. And it is why you see veterans pathetically trying to recreate this comradeship after the war, a pitiful and fruitless activity that is usually laced with the abuse of another drug, alcohol. In fact, comradeship is the very opposite of friendship. In friendship, we struggle, often painfully, to attain a greater sense of self. We become through the friend more aware of who we are. We find ourselves in a friend. In comradeship, the kind that comes to us in patriotic fervor, there is a suppression of self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-possession. Comrades lose their identities in wartime for the collective rush of a common cause. In comradeship, there are no demands on the self. This is part of its appeal, and one of the reasons we miss it and seek to recreate it. The feeling of comradeship is one of war's many attractions. Friends do not, the way comrades do, love death and sacrifice. To friends, the prospect of death is frightening. To lose a friend is to lose part of yourself, that intimate dialogue with another that may never be recreated. There is no ecstatic embrace of death in friendship. And this is why friendship, or let me say love, is the most potent enemy of war. War is carefully packaged, the way tobacco or liquor companies package their own poisons. We taste a bit of war's exhilaration in the images in films, novels, war narratives, and the press, but we remain safe. And in this safety, we are fooled into believing that we can control war, instead of the awful fact that war almost always controls and ultimately, if we do not get out, destroys us. We can thrill in the perversity of war, even as we watch films or read books that are meant to denounce war. It is almost impossible to produce anti-war films or documentaries that also present images of battle. It is like trying to condemn pornography while showing erotic love scenes. War is a manufactured commodity. It is expensive. It is part of the modern industrial landscape. Indeed, the tools are often the cutting edges of technology. The machines of war, the planes, the tanks, the heavy machine guns, the huge howitzers, the helicopters are pieces of art. I have seen them at work. They are angels of death streaking through the sky. The chief institutions that peddle the myth of war are the state and the press. Nearly every war correspondent sees his or her mission as sustaining civilian and army morale. The advent of photography and film did little to alter the incentive to boost morale, for the lie in war is almost always the lie of omission. The blunders and senseless slaughters by our generals, the ruthless murder of prisoners and innocents, the horror of wounds, these are not disclosed. Only when the myth is punctured, as it was in Vietnam, does the media begin to report in a sensory rather than a mythic manner. And once the veil of myth is pulled back, once war is seen for what it is, it becomes hard to bear and hard to prosecute. The first experience of war, like the first high, appears to make the world instantly understandable, a black and white tableau of them and us. War suspends thought, especially self-critical thought. It seems as if for the first time we are able to see clearly the fundamental questions about our own existence, the meaning or meaninglessness of our place on the planet. All this is laid bare, even as we, along with those we watch, sink to the lowest depth. War exposes a side of human nature that is usually masked by the unacknowledged coercion and social constraints that glue us together. Our cultivated conventions and little lies of civility lull us into a refined and idealistic view of ourselves. But war lays all this bare. War, however, soon rules us. It lowers us to the moral depravity that plagues all addicts. The business of organized violence leads us to abandon fixed and established values. Moral precepts we have spent a lifetime honoring are jettisoned. We accept the maiming and killing of innocents as the cost of war. We give up moral code for war, and no class or political group is immune. The reality of war takes a long time to seep into us. This is because thrown into the maw of war, fooled by the myths peddled by the state and the press, we do not trust our own senses. We speak with the words and phrase minted for us in wartime, the war on terror, the axis of evil, showdown with Iraq, but sit on the eve of a real battle, and I think of American units on the night before we invaded Kuwait, and you see the void of war. Soldiers in these moments weep, vomit, write last letters home, although these letters are scribbled more as a precaution than from a belief. All are nearly paralyzed with fright. There is a morbid silence that grips a battlefield in the final moments before the shooting starts. No one ever charges into battle for God and country. Freud divided the forces in human nature between eros, that impulse within us to preserve, to become close to others, to conserve, and the death instinct, or thanatos, that impulse that works towards the annihilation of all living things, including ourselves. For Freud, these forces were in eternal conflict. He was pessimistic about ever eradicating war. All human history, he argued, is a tug of war between these two instincts. We became, after our defeat in Vietnam, a better country. We were forced to ask questions about ourselves we had not asked before. We had to confront our own capacity for evil, for atrocity, for terror. We were humbled, even humiliated, and in that experience we sought to see ourselves as others saw us. And it was not always a pretty sight. But gradually the myth rose up again. We took generous cups from the river Lethe to forget. We celebrated our military prowess under the Reagan administration, and this culminated in the Persian Gulf War, which again made war respectable. There is a constant search in war to find new perversities, new forms of death when the initial flush fades, a rearguard and finally futile effort to ward off the boredom of routine death. Addicts know this. This is why we would drive into Bosnia and find bodies crucified on the sides of barns or decapitated and mutilated. It is why those slain in combat are treated as trophies belonging to the killers, turned into grotesque pieces of performance art. I know soldiers who to this day carry in their wallets the identity cards of men they know they killed. They take them everywhere. They show them to you with the imploring look of a lost child. They will never understand. The job of killing always leads to depravity. It allows our senses to command our bodies. It whips fighters into greater orgies of destruction. Hedonism and perversion spiral out of control. Those who worked hard all their lives are reviled as dupes and fools. They haunt the soup kitchens. The normal order is turned upside down. And bodies, just as they lie scattered and immobile a few hundred yards away, become tools, objects to an end. In the midst of slaughter, the choice swiftly becomes between hate and lust. When this mask of war, the myth of war, slips away, when the rot and corruption is uncovered, when the addiction turns sour and rank, we feel spoiled and spent. It is then that we sink into despair. In the Arab-Israeli 1973 war, almost a third of all Israeli casualties were due to psychiatric causes, and the war lasted only a few weeks. A World War II study determined that after 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of all surviving soldiers will have become psychiatric casualties. And this study found that a common trait among the 2% who were able to endure sustained combat was a predisposition toward aggressive psychopathic personalities. War ascendant wipes out love, wipes out eros. When we see this for what it is, when we understand ourselves and how war has perverted us, life becomes hard to bear. John Steele, a cameraman who spent years in war zones, had a nervous breakdown in a crowded Heathrow airport in 1994 after returning from Sarajevo. I came back from Sarajevo, he said. We were in a place called Sniper's Alley, and I filmed a girl there who had been hit in the neck by a sniper's bullet. I filmed her in the ambulance, and only after she was dead, I suddenly understood that the last thing she had seen was the reflection of the lens of the camera I was holding in front of her face. This wiped me out. A year after the war in Sarajevo, I sat with Bosnian friends who had suffered horribly. A young woman, Liliana, had lost her father, a Serb who refused to join the besieging Serb forces around the city. She had been forced a few days earlier to identify the corpse. The body was lifted, the water running out of the sides of a rotting coffin from a small park for reburial in the central cemetery. She was emigrating for Australia soon, where she told me, "I will marry a man who has never heard of this war and raise children that will be told nothing about it, nothing about the country I am from." Yet she and her friends, all they did that afternoon was lament the days when they lived in fear and danger, emaciated, targeted by Serb gunners. They did not wish back the suffering, and yet they admitted these may have been the fullest days of their lives. They looked at me in despair. I knew them when they were being pounded by hundreds of shells a day, when they had no water to bathe or wash their clothes, when they sat huddled in unheated, darkened flats as sniper bullets thumped into the walls. But what they expressed was real. It was the disillusionment with a sterile, futile, and empty present. Peace had again peeled back the void that the rush of war, of battle, had filled. Once again they were, as perhaps we all are, alone, no longer bound by the common sense of struggle, no longer given the opportunity to be noble, heroic, no longer sure what life was about and what it meant. The only antidote to war is love. And although I saw much death in my life, I was also a witness to love's power. When a shell landed in Sarajevo, its awful explosion tore apart bodies that lay in pools of their own blood. Yet at the very moment of death's sting, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, lovers, friends, tore frantically through the crowd looking for loved ones. One felt, radiating out from the spot, these concentric waves of love and death, battle each other in the leaden skies above Sarajevo. Of course, gentle and decent people will be wiped out. Of course, we as distinct individuals may not survive. But love has the power finally to affirm what we know we must affirm, and to protect what we know we must protect. And the only antidote to war is this, is the ability to see in the other a love, even those who are our enemy, that is like our own. Love alone gives us the meaning that endures. Many of those I worked with as a war correspondent during the past 2 decades never escaped. They could not break free. They never saw the myth of war for what it was. Death that lured them into war finally consumed them. They wandered from conflict to conflict. By then, I was back in Gaza at the start of the current Palestinian uprising. I found myself pinned down in another ambush. A young man about 10 feet from me was shot through the chest and killed. I felt none of the old rush, just fear. It was time to break free, to let go. I was lucky to get out alive. Kurt Schork, brilliant, courageous, and driven, could not. He died in an ambush in May 2000 in Sierra Leone, along with another friend, Miguel Gil Moreno. His entrapment, his embrace of death, was never mentioned at the sterile and antiseptic memorial service staged for him in Washington by the Reuters bureaucrats he often warred with. Everyone tiptoed around it, but those of us who knew him understood that he had been consumed. I had worked with Kurt for 10 years, starting in northern Iraq. Literate, funny, it seems the brave are often funny. He and I passed books back and forth in our struggle to make sense of the madness around us. His loss is a hole that will never be filled. His ashes were placed in the Lions Cemetery in Sarajevo for victims of the war. I flew to Sarajevo and met the British filmmaker Dan Reed. It was an overcast November day. We stood over the grave and downed a pint of whiskey. Dan lit a candle. I recited a poem by the Roman lyric poet Catullus, one he had written to honor his own dead brother. By strangers' coasts and waters, many days at sea, I come here for the rites of your unworlding, bringing for you, the dead, these last gifts of the living, and my words, vain sounds for a man of dust. Alas, my brother, you have been taken from me. You have been taken from me and by cold chance turned to shadow and my pain. Here are the foods of the old ceremony appointed long ago for the starvelings under the earth. Take them. Your brother's tears have made them wet, and take into eternity my hail and my farewell. It was there, among a few thousand war dead, that Kurt belonged. He died because he could not free himself from war. He was trying to replicate what he had found in Sarajevo, but he could not. War could never be new again. Kurt had been in East Timor and Chechnya. Sierra Leone, I was sure, meant nothing to him. He could not let go, nor could Miguel, they would be the first to admit it. Spend long enough in war, and you cannot fit in anywhere else. The drug of war finally kills you. It is not a news story. Addicts that don't kick it end up the same way. It starts out like love, but it is death. War is the beautiful young nymph in the fairy tale that, when kissed, exhales the vapors of the underworld. The ancient Greeks had a word for such a fate, ekpyrosis. It means to be consumed by a ball of fire. They used it to describe heroes. Thank you.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Chris Hedges discussing Does War Give Us Meaning? I'm going to ask the first question, Chris. As we record this, we are moving ever closer to war with Iraq. You mentioned in your remarks how Vietnam, for at least a generation of people, was sort of the end of innocence in terms of the illusion of the nobility of war. And that was largely due to the fact that there were tens of thousands of body bags probably coming home over those years. Now we fight wars where our casualties number in the dozens. And that's largely due to the technological advances that we've been making. And in terms of our weaponry, how has technology changed our attitudes towards the acceptability of war?
I think we're very much, as I mentioned briefly, in a situation like the imperial powers at the end of the 19th century, where, by that, before World War I, because of the immense superiority, technological superiority, war had become sort of the sport of the aristocracy. And these powers believed as well that their technology made them invulnerable. Of course, they ended this ended in World War I, and I just read a great book by Fred Morton on the beginning of Thunder at Twilight, the end of the Habsburg Empire, that last year before the war, and all of these powers stumbled into this mass suicide with absolutely no conception of what they were getting into. The fact is, we possess now, in essence, apocalyptic weapons, and those who we are fighting are working very hard to get their hands on the same thing. These weapons, or along with these weapons, come an apocalyptic vision. And you see, I think what is striking about both the sort of ideology of the Islamist fundamentalist movement that's arrayed against us and ourselves is that we both speak about sanitation. War is about, ridding the world of a bacteria. And it's not about conquering a nation state. That's not what the war on terror is about. It's this never-ending war. And I think the subtext of this campaign to sort of wipe out terrorists is sold to us as a way of sort of wiping out evil. Those who are fighting us have a no less frightening kind of theology. We call them the barbarians. They call us the infidels. They see us as a kind of contagion because of our culture and tradition. We see them as a kind of contagion. And because we believe that our technology makes us invulnerable, this lie sold to us in the Persian Gulf War and Kosovo and Bosnia, I think that is why we as a nation have just been sheared like sheep in the march towards war. And unfortunately, every generation has to learn anew. And the cost is, many, many, many dead and many innocent dead. So our technology, if history is any guide, does not make us invulnerable. And that belief is allowing us to engage in a kind of adventurism in the Middle East that I think could go horribly wrong.
Yeah, 1 second, thanks. You also... Thanks. Be quiet. You talk in your book, and you also mentioned in your comments how the media has perpetuated this myth of war as being romantic and noble, and that in writing about it, there are certain devices, ways of phrasing images that we conjure up that sort of inevitably add to that stereotype. In your own writing, how do you avoid using those conventions? Can you avoid using those conventions?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you do, but when you're approaching it.
Well, because the entire book is a sort of withering assault on every single myth that is sold to us about war, and I've got 15 years of very concrete examples to throw at you to prove it. And I think that's probably the power of it, is that it's written off the ground, of course, from various parts around the globe.
All right. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop this.
I'll fucking leave, yeah, I'll fucking leave. It's fucking cut.
You talked somewhat famously about Israeli soldiers luring Palestinian kids to the edge of the settlements and shooting them. And one, I was wondering what you think the psychology of those soldiers was. And two, how do you think both sides can get rid of their psychosis or intoxication? And how does the conflict illustrate most pointedly your main theses?
Well, Robert J. Lifton has expressed this more eloquently than I can. But I think what has happened in Gaza and the West Bank is very similar to what happened to American soldiers in Vietnam, where there's a terrible kind of frustration at trying to fight an elusive enemy, and the feeling that because you're living in the midst of a hostile population, everybody is the enemy. And he calls these atrocity-producing situations. I don't think that Israeli soldiers in Gaza or the West Bank act any differently than we acted in Vietnam, or that the French acted in Algeria, or that any soldier acts when essentially they're living in that kind of environment. The problem is that you create a kind of illusion where, even elderly Palestinian working in a field suddenly become the enemy you can't find, the enemy you have to strike. And what I saw in Han Yunis was, I think, indicative of that, where you had over loudspeakers fixed on an Israeli armored jeep behind an electric fence. They were taunting young kids who were playing out in the dunes. And then when they started throwing the rocks, they opened fire. And there is, unfortunately, unit discipline on the part of the IDF in the territories has just, in my mind, completely collapsed. I mean, the notion that you can use live rounds from an M16 on a 10-year-old boy is inexcusable. And anybody who's been in a conflict knows very well that these bullets are designed to go in you the size of a dime, and they come out the size of an orange. They spin end over end. That's how they're designed. They rip your stomach out. The wounds are just absolutely horrific. And so I was stunned. I mean, that was stunning for me. On the other hand, I don't think that it's an uncommon response given the situation that the Israeli soldiers are in. I think we responded the same way in Vietnam. I think when any time you are living in a sea of hostility like that with an enemy you can never quite grasp, and then of course you have the frustration and anger of losing your own troops, losing your own soldiers to, there are car bombs on the side of the road and that kind of stuff, and they just can't sort of get it. The enemy is sort of phantom-like.
Hello. As I hear you speak, one word comes to mind. I'll make a real quick comment and then a question. That Bush is, in his arrogant, warped way of rushing us into the war with Iraq, is making the world much less secure and bringing our country into much greater danger. the word comes to mind that it's treasonous what he's doing. It's just clear to me. And my comment is that it seems like the winds of change are blowing somewhat, such that even the Wall Street Journal is beginning to come out, editorial today and a big ad the other day with businessmen on the right suggesting that he's not doing right by them. What's your view of how the winds of change...
You raise a very good point. I am just stunned that we can talk about war as if it's a kind of precise surgery, where we go in, we excise Saddam Hussein, and everything's neat and clean. That's not what war is. War is a mess, and war is chaotic, and war is a blunt instrument that often makes the situation worse. There are so many ways that our situation here at home, that we can become so much more vulnerable and that the situation can deteriorate. First of all, we know that the Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction. According to the CIA report that was leaked to the New York Times, in that report they said they have no evidence that he's planning to use them, but they believe that if he feels he's going to go down, he will use them. What does a Scud dropped on Tel Aviv with nerve agents do? I mean, what will Israeli F-16s flying over Basra do in the Middle East? What will a dirty bomb wiping out an entire Marine Corps tank battalion do? The potential for this to unravel and become messy is not only, I think, completely evident, but is always true once you begin employing violence. That's why we periodically learn our lesson by sort of holding the hand of the CIA to do assassinations, as they did in the early days in Vietnam, a situation that made our situation in Vietnam worse, or the 1954 coup in Iran that led finally directly to the Ayatollahs. Once we start doing social engineering in regions and countries we don't really understand, once we start employing force like this, the situation usually, I think, becomes worse. So, yes, I think that by going to war with Iraq, our situation becomes less secure, and I understand why the Bush administration is doing this. This is about oil. I hope this doesn't surprise anybody. What I don't understand is how, as a nation, we have been so completely passive, how the Congress has essentially washed their hands of this and handed this awesome power to the president. That stunned me. And I think it's because we do, on some level, believe this lie that our nation can wage war and it won't affect us. And unfortunately, by the time we wake up and realize that that is a lie, there will probably be a lot of American dead.
Going back to the first question a bit, and could you comment, say, on the Vukovar syndrome versus the kind of phantom enemy psychology, if you will?
Vukovar. Well, the Vukovar syndrome comes from Serb cowardice, where the Serbs never wanted to risk any soldiers. You all know Vukovar was under siege in the same way that Sarajevo was, Vukovar for 3 months, where they just shelled it into oblivion, because they had the heavy weapons of the old Yugoslav army, and they were just going to take 5 shots of Slivovitz and keep loading heavy shells until essentially the Muslims or the Croats gave up. So that was the Vukovar. This is what you're speaking about. It was tactical. And that was part of the whole myth that we got sold. You know, we got sold a bunch of lies about the Serbs, that they would fight until the last man, that, Yugoslavs didn't have any kind of a national identity, despite Josip Broz Tito's making Yugoslavia player on the world, all sorts of stuff. And every time I was in the war, and I was in the 5th Corps when they went across central Bosnia in the fall of '95, and the Serbs didn't have that artillery to back them up, they fled like lemmings. So that was what happened in Vukovar.
You give a kind of reified metaphysical approach to war, which seems like a kind of divinity school approach. But there are many hard political questions and issues involved in all of these conflicts that have to be resolved. Speaking again about your experience in Can Yunis, these people are not enemies. These people are victims. These people are under occupation, illegal occupation for the past 35 years. And you say that the lie of war is the lie of omission. Why is it that publications such as your own, like the New York Times, don't report the depravity of the IDF, which America is supporting in making these types of actions possible? Why is there so much omission in the mainstream media?
Yeah, I think there is a failure in mainstream media on this issue. I think the Europeans are a lot better.
Right.
We, for reasons that are beyond me, don't station Arabic-speaking reporters in Gaza or the West Bank. I think the best coverage is the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, with Danny Rubenstein, Amir Haas, who's in Ramallah. They speak Arabic. Danny's covered the Palestinians since '68, and I think it's a terrible, terrible failing on the part of the mainstream media. I would agree with you. I mean, I think my problem. I think our reporting on Israel isn't so bad, but we just don't begin to uncover the kinds of nuances within Palestinian society. That it is a kind of very black and white tableau, and a very incorrect one, and it allows us very easily to engage in stereotypes about Palestinians that are unfair. I mean, for instance, one of the things that drives me nuts is this notion that Palestinian children want their kids to become suicide bombers. This smacks of that old story that, the Vietnamese don't really care about the dead like we do. I've just spent enough time, I speak Arabic, and when I cover Gaza, I live there. I don't live in Jerusalem. And, I've been with mothers who are as bereaved and shaken as all mothers are. I think the point you raise is a good one. I mean, you're right.
Good evening. I'm a physician. Absolutely brilliant talk. One of the best I've ever heard. Congratulations. And war is going to happen. We know that. You can't have 500,000 troops sitting there with hands on the trigger. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. But what my question is, wars are civilian driven. The wars aren't started by generals. They're started by civilians.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
Well, war at its most fundamental level is about betrayal. It's about betrayal of the young by the old, and it's about betrayal of soldiers by politicians. There's that great poem by Kipling. It's Johnny this and Johnny that and chuck him out the brute, but it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. I have a lot of friends in the Marine Corps because I went into Kuwait with the Marines in the Persian Gulf War, and a lot of them are over there now. Although one, right before he left, colonel, battalion commander, called and asked he said, is the newspaper going to send you? And I said, well, I've told the newspaper I'm not going. And he said, good, because I just wanted to let you know I wasn't going to lift a finger to help you. The Marines, of course, essentially the shock infantry forces will pay the price for this if we try and take the streets of Baghdad or Basra. And wars tend to be driven by politicians out of often very narrow self-interest. Sometimes those interests are so narrow it's just about pride and arrogance. But Homer wrote all about this in the Iliad. It's nothing new.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to pick up and expand on the question about the coverage. As an aside, I think that for me, one of the crucial failings of the coverage in the New York Times of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is that when there is Palestinian violence, it is characterized in a certain way. When there is Israeli violence, it is always characterized as retaliation. And the retaliator always has the moral high ground. I would like, you said you don't understand, and I mean I'm sympathetic to what you've been saying. You don't understand why we could have had the war resolution passed. I think we have a tremendous, tremendous failing on the part of what I call corporate media. People call it mainstream media, I call it corporate media. And I wonder if you could expand a little on some of what you've already said on what kind of a job. I mean, we can expect, I suppose, a drumbeat for war from the propaganda machine of the Bush administration or any war-bent administration. Could you talk about the ways in which the corporate media are so willingly partnering with this drumbeat, so that every day when the Bush administration says the same thing they said yesterday, he's got to go, it's the front page headline. He's got to go every day. He's got to go. He's got to go. And another just quick comment for your is the comradeship that you talk about. Can't there be a healthy version of that comradeship in resisting this kind of march for war?
First of all, I don't have a problem with this term, the corporate media. That is essentially what most media outlets have become, although not the New York Times. It's still family-owned like the Washington Post. But in wartime, the press is always part of the problem, and always has been since the Crimean War, when the modern war correspondent was invented. The problem is that the press in wartime sees its role as sustaining the morale of the nation and the troops, of supporting the cause. That's why you have, all these newscasters with the little flags in their lapels, and Dan Rather going on saying, where do I sign up, or whatever inanity he said. But that is the press, and that was certainly the role of the press in the Persian Gulf War. The press, the sad fact is that in the end, of course, the institution that I work for is a business. And mythic war sells newspapers and boosts ratings. Look at CNN. Nobody watches CNN until we go to war. And it's all that flag-waving mythology, that feel-good stuff, that notion, that sense that, we're empowered by our powerful military that's out there fighting evil. All of that stuff sells. And real war reporting, or sensory war reporting, does not. So, although there has been the issue you raised, that the media has become dominated by a few corporations, in wartime that almost doesn't make a difference. In wartime, those people that report honestly, I'm thinking of Morrill, the great journalist, a British pacifist and journalist who ended up in prison finally towards the end of the war in Britain, I.F. Stone, forced out of his job by McCarthy, and then, ignored and reviled, not only by the public, but by his own, i.e. us, the press. And this is a terrible, terrible problem in war. I mean, when I covered the war in Bosnia, you got a sense of what the war was like because I wasn't a Serb, a Croat, or a Muslim. You saw it for the raw slaughter that it was. But if I was in the same place, the same town as a Serb journalist, I would suddenly feel compelled, I'm not picking on Serbs, the Croats and the Muslims did the same, to create that mythic narrative. Who was the hero? What brave act? What woman was saved by our gallant Serb soldiers? No, it's what we do. It's what we all do in war. I mean, we turn Schwarzkopf, a fairly surly character, into Ulysses S. Grant. And it was almost, it is irrelevant as to who, it could have been anyone else. But we need, and if it wasn't Schwarzkopf, it would have been someone else. We need that hero. We need that icon. We need all those set pieces of the myth. And not only is the press terribly guilty in that sense of creating the myth, which is a lie, but it also uses the language. And by using the language, you don't have your capacity, or what is robbed of you is your capacity to speak. In wartime, there's always a hijacking of language. And when your language is hijacked and you speak in the cliches in which you're given, whatever disquiet you have becomes almost impossible to articulate or express. But more importantly, you can't communicate with the other side. You see everybody as a nationalist, everybody in your own vision. So that, if Yasser Arafat says he wants to stop the suicide bombings, you don't believe him because you know what Yasser Arafat. The language becomes powerless. And the only way you get peace back is by bringing language back. You don't have peace in Cyprus. You don't have peace in Bosnia. What you have is the absence of war. You don't have peace until you create a common narrative by which people can speak again, as they did in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That whatever injustice occurred by allowing the killers of the apartheid regime to go free, those confessions were important because they allowed people to communicate again. And once you fall into the rhetoric of war, the cliches of war, the jingoism of war, which we have already done, it almost makes war itself inevitable.
You mentioned you mentioned war correspondents that you've known who have died with their addiction to war, and on the other hand, it seems that you underwent some kind of transformation in that respect, where you felt differently about the whole experience. And I was wondering if you could say something more about what changed for you in that respect.
Well, I had a couple sobering moments. The loss of Kurt was one. Finding myself at the age of 41 or something, sprinting away from the Netzarim Junction with 17-year-old Palestinian kids carrying bags of Molotov cocktails, and being fired on by Israeli snipers. I realized it was just lunacy, and that I had to stop. All that said, it was a very long, painful, and hard process, because my identity was wrapped up in it. I had grown to relish that sort of camaraderie of the war correspondent community. I mean, there are people in Kosovo I covered the war with in El Salvador. The rush of it. Part of doing that is a way of fleeing from the normal responsibility in life. It took me a few years to shake it. It was very hard. It was not an easy process. It wasn't waking up and deciding to quit.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm Thomas Michelson. I'm the minister of the church here. You and I met in James Luther Adams' living room.
Yeah, he's a great man.
I have a short comment and a question. The comment is, it's a brilliant analysis of war. And you, in your comments, have crept very close to what I would see as a traditional argument for nonviolence, that love is the only answer. And yet I haven't heard you really outwardly develop an argument for nonviolence as an alternative to war. And then to complicate that issue, your teacher and mine, James Luther Adams, went to Germany in the 1930s and saw what was happening, and came back to this country saying there are some purposes for war. When a true evil exists in the world, there's a place for armies and a place for military conflict. And I don't know how you sort that out, and I'd love it if you could respond to both, sort of where are you with the classical kind of nonviolence based on a philosophy of love, and is there a place for military conflict?
Well, by temperament, I'm a pacifist. Unfortunately, because we live in a fallen world, I think there are times when not only our own survival, but evil presents its face to us to such an extent that we must employ violence. As Reinhold Niebuhr said, it's never a choice between moral and immoral, it's a choice between immoral and more immoral. I think the fundamental lesson of the Holocaust, and Elie Wiesel got this at the dedication of the Holocaust Museum, is that when we have the capacity to stop genocide, and we do not, we are culpable. We have blood on our hands. For that reason, I supported the intervention in Bosnia, I supported the intervention in Kosovo, and I feel we failed as a nation by not intervening in Rwanda, where it would have been even easier to stop the genocide. And because of that, we have blood on our hands because of Rwanda. There are moments, and I know in the war in El Salvador, when I arrived in Salvador, the death squads were killing 800 to 1,000 people a month. And this is a country essentially run like a feudal farm by 10 families. 50% of the Salvadoran peasants were landless. They were pushed. They had marched peacefully in the street, and the Salvadoran army had opened fire on them. I understood why they picked up a gun. At the same time, I also understood that by employing that violence, They were corrupting themselves and corrupting their society, and Salvador today proves it with the gang violence and Guatemala as well. So violence is always an evil. War is always an evil. It's always tragic when it happens, but sometimes it should happen, and sometimes there's no alternative. But even violence employed for a good cause can corrupt and pervert. All of the things I talk about in my book about what violence does to you irregardless of the cause.
Thank you so much. That's another wonderful answer, but it does sound to me with that answer like there's virtually no way off the track.
You mean whether we can engage in nonviolence? Nonviolence?
Right.
Well, nonviolence, worked very well for Martin Luther King and Gandhi in democracies, but I don't think it would have worked too well with Stalin or Hitler or Saddam Hussein. And, you have to always measure the time and the place. But always nonviolence is preferable. When you can appeal to something, the sort of genius of Martin Luther King of making us, presenting our values to us, and through his words and his life and his actions showing how we fail to meet those values. But there are societies where that isn't going to work.
I've heard a couple people tonight talk about the inevitability of this war, and I guess probably rationally I realize that, but just everything in me resists that. I don't want to believe that. I don't want to accept that. I think what you've said, people in this room, we're common citizens. We demonstrate and write letters and send email and sign petitions. But I guess I find myself thinking, why can't the people in power hear what you're saying? And it just seems so eminently sensible and true. And I wonder if you have any advice for us of what people can do that would be more helpful in trying to resist this war that seems to be coming on us.
Well, I think the people in power, not that I'm privy to their discussions, I think the people in power don't really care. I think that they very much see their goal as, through our military, essentially dominating those parts of the world where there are resources that are advantageous to the furtherance of our own power and the maintenance of our own imperium. I think there's a real callousness, and if that means the sacrifice of soldiers, of our own soldiers, I think they're more than willing to do it. What can people do? Well, at this point, our entire political system failed us in the elections because, with the exception of Wellstone and a few others, the Democrats never even bothered to raise it as an issue. So there was a kind of moral bankruptcy within the political system for which we're all going to pay for. I mean, I'm like you, I'm very frustrated. And, you do what you can, and in the end, you're saved by faith. You have to be.
Yeah, so there's a question that a lot of people use: you have to fight fire with fire. And my question is this: if North Korea stated to Washington, and they meant it, and they were willing to go through, if North Korea said, if you in any way, shape, or form go into Iraq, then we will shoot and do damage to your troops in South Korea. You attack Iraq, and we're going to attack South Korea. Would that work, sir?
Let me just talk about why I don't like this war. In a democracy, you can't go to war. You can't ask citizens in a democracy to send their children to war if you do not share with them credible evidence that there is a threat to their own security and the security of the nation. That is not a nicety. That is not something that we, should wish them to do. That's fundamental to a democratic system. And we live with a government that feels that it doesn't have to. And I don't think they're showing it to us because they don't have it. And you can't wage war because you don't like somebody, especially given the scenarios that can spin out. You present a hypothetical case. And having covered foreign affairs for many years, there are so many nuances and changes. And, it's if North Korea said that they were going to, use ballistic missiles to deliver payloads of nuclear weapons on South Korea, then I suppose we'd probably have no choice. Although, the irony of this is that, we were, all the time we were getting ready to go to war with Iraq, there was North Korea with, known nuclear warheads, stockpiles of chemical and biological agents, and we were giving them $4 billion a year and helping them build their nuclear. We were buying them off. And I think we were buying them off because there's no oil in North Korea. The notion that this is actually, that this has anything to do with a real threat, I find difficult to swallow. We are not going to war with Iraq because there is a real credible threat against us. We are going to war with Iraq because we want to control the second largest oil reserves in the world. That's why we're going to war with Iraq.
A friend of mine today reported on a meeting with Barney Frank. I don't know how many in the room are aware of the campaign that MoveOn.org is doing. I would hope that everyone is on their email list and communicating with their congresspeople and senators and so on per their recommendations. But Barney Frank said today that and he too is, I'm most upset by the despair that I hear in this room and in your voice. I kind of can't believe that the citizens of the richest nation in the world, the most comfortable lifestyle in the world, let themselves to fall prey to such despair and powerlessness when we're the most powerful nation in the world. This is the most grotesque sin to me. We just can't let this happen. We can't tell each other that there is no hope for change. We can't tell each other that we can't change anything. Barney Frank was saying this to the delegation that went and met with him. 9,000 meetings were held today across the country with legislators. If our elected representatives feel that we will not again elect them, they will change things. Email the Progressive Caucus members. Give them some courage. Barney Frank said today, write all of your friends in England, because if the British population does not support this war, it may not happen. That was his advice. Thank you.
Actually, when I heard you mention Mr. Adams, he was a friend of mine too. We used to have peanut butter sandwiches. Oh, sorry. This is a question that's been bugging me for a long time, and it's kind of on a whim. I was thinking with what happened on September 11th and how it changed so much in our world, and I was wondering if you had the same amount of time, money, and intellectual power that it took to make September 11th happen. Is there any way that the same amount of time, money, and intellectual power could be used for constructive rather than destructive purposes?
Are you talking about...
I was thinking oh, sorry.
You're talking about the people who carried out 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, I know that September 11th really wasn't carried out by that small group of people, that it took years of planning, a lot of money, a lot of training, including by the CIA. But What I'm saying is that it seems that a relatively small group of people and a relatively small amount of money change the world in a very destructive way. Would it be possible to change the world constructively with the same amount of money, power, and
well, it's
people?
the children of light and children of darkness. I mean, it's a constant battle. Martin Luther King changed the world constructively, but there's always going to be forces, nihilistic forces that embrace violence, that murder innocents. I mean, that's going to always be with us. And I think one of the things you have to remember that pushes suicide bombers in Gaza and the West Bank is that they feel so closed off that this is the only way they feel they can affirm themselves. And we have to give them other ways to affirm themselves besides death. I think that's an important point.
I guess the big question is how you could use those resources. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always two types of energy in the world, and that evil is never going to go away. Unfortunately, it's a constant battle.
It seems that it's like any time there might be a war, you always have the which has been called the chicken hawk contingent, which people who are all gung ho for the war and never spent 1 minute in the service.
Well, that sort of sums up our government. I think that's a big problem. I mean, the people who've seen, I just spent a day with the superintendent of West Point as a two-star general, and other friends of mine who went to West Point and graduated and went on to Vietnam, and there's nothing quite like somebody who's been through war to really know what war is and how deeply you hate war, and that's often professional soldiers.
Yes, look in Georgia, the Senate race.
I'm going to interject a question here to sort of follow up on that line of thought, Chris. You obviously have a number of relationships with soldiers, with people that have seen combat, and those are likely many of the same people that will see combat again if we go into Iraq. Do you have a sense of how they feel about this war, impending war?
Well, there's clearly a lot of disquiet within the military, as there is, interestingly enough, within the intelligence community, within the CIA. And I think that's something that should give us all a great deal of pause when you have our intelligence services and many of our professional soldiers warning us that this is not something we want to get into. But yeah, there's a lot of reticence about embarking on this.
I agree with your that oil is probably the primary motivating factor for us wanting to get into Iraq. But I wonder what you think of this other theory that I've heard as a Bush family vendetta. In other words, I've heard that George Bush Sr. was almost killed when he was in Kuwait by the Iraqis.
Yes, that's true. There was a car
And
bomb.
that, so this is really, Papa Bush saying to Baby Bush, you go over and get that SOB because he tried to kill me.
I've read it, but I don't know George Bush, either one of them, and so I can't. I mean, I think oil is, I think that's pretty big.
Thank you for your words and thoughts. We often hear of coups in other countries, military. We hear of breakup within other militaries, and most recently we heard of the movement by Israeli soldiers and officers, I believe, to say they would not da-da-da-da. If you have some knowledge of our military, can you see that it is conceivable? Has there ever been anything in our history that would allow those people to challenge the commander-in-chief?
Well, we're a long way from that yet. I mean, you have to remember that in Israel, this group, the Courage to Resist, it took them, it's taken them several years of the Palestinian uprising in order to form the group. It was also true in Lebanon that these things take a long time there's a long period of gestation there. I could see it happening, but we're not anywhere near that now. And the war hasn't started, so.
Hi, yes, thanks for coming. I read Gaza Diary not too long ago, I guess, probably long after it was written, and more recently also Overwhelming Force by Seymour Hersh, also in the New Yorker. And I thought it was a good, gave a good sense of how the chaos on the battlefield and how things can spin out of control, even in that limited sphere of the immediate battle. And I'd recommend it to anybody, and you can find it on the web. And I'm wondering, what's your perspective on the accuracy of that article? And if you want to recap it, feel free. And the significance of it. And also, have you worked with Seymour Hersh, and do you have any observations on him? Thank you.
I think he's very good. I don't want to get into the intricacies of Overwhelming Force. There's quite a long debate over that story, as you know. But I mean, I will just say in summary that I think he's one of the great investigative journalists in the country. I admire his work a lot.
Sort of wrap up, Chris. In all of your years of field reporting, as you've mentioned, you have seen some incredible atrocities. I was wondering if maybe we could end this on maybe a slightly lighter note. Not that I think that that's necessary. I think it's good to carry this with us, but could you share some of those moments of humanity that you saw?
I spend more time on this in the book than obviously I can in a short talk. One always hesitates to start talking about love as the answer, feel like the Beatles or something. But in fact, these small acts of love and compassion in wartime that from the outside often look irrelevant have a kind of cumulative power and weight. Most of the people who rescued Jews in Europe during the Second World War, like those who rescued people from other ethnic groups in Bosnia, were couples. They were couples who found fulfillment in their own relationship. And usually one couple was sort of the idealist, took the moral stance, and the other could carry out those sort of daily acts of compassion that require such patience to take care of another. There became a kind of completeness in the relationship and a kind of self-definition in the relationship that was able to defy these false covenants of race and nationality that are handed to us in wartime, indeed handed to us all the time. And I would remember going in El Salvador or in Bosnia, homes of these couples, and it was always a kind of sanctuary. You were freed from the insanity, the infection of war. We used to call it in Bosnia the Linda Blair effect, where we thought we'd suddenly found the one Serb who could speak to us normally, and then after 15 minutes their heads started to spin around, just like everyone else. But couples were often immune from this. And there's a story in the book about a Muslim farmer in Gorazda, which was one of the UN safe areas that was surrounded by the Serbs. In fact, the people of Gorazda had a much more horrible time of it during the war than the people in Sarajevo. And there were some Serbs in Gorazda, as there was in Sarajevo, and a young couple had, the woman was pregnant. Eventually the Muslim police dragged her husband away. He disappeared, presumably dead. And she gave birth to the child. She couldn't breastfeed. There was no food. There was constant shelling. They were giving the baby tea, and after 10 days it started to die. And this illiterate farmer in rubber boots, his name was Fadil Fazic, had 3 cows that he kept out in a pasture that was under sniper fire, and so he would go out and milk them in the dark and sell the milk. And at that time, milk, because there were no cows, virtually, was a very precious commodity. And when he found out that his neighbor's child was dying, he appeared one morning at the doorstep with a liter of milk for the baby, and gave that baby, I think for 400 and some days or 240 days or, a long time, every morning. Well, of course, everyone in the apartment block understood that the farmer was bringing milk to this Serb child. And in the mornings when he would come up, they would open their doors and spit at him and revile him for feeding Chetnik babies. And he endured it until finally the couple was able to leave Gorazda. Now, I found out about this story because I was outside of Gorazda, interviewing Serbs who had lived in Gorazda about what had happened to them. And there was immense anger among the parents and the young woman over the disappearance of the husband, of her husband and of their son. But as they let loose this diatribe, they stopped and they said, but we can't say that all Serbs are bad. All Muslims are bad. There are good Muslims. And they told me this story. I went back and found the farmer. All of his cows had died. His apartment was bombed out, and he was living in a corridor, sleeping in a corridor with about 20 other men. And during the day, they would pick worm-eaten apples off a tree and lay them out on a piece of newspaper and try and sell them to get something to eat. And when I told him that I had met the couple, the first question he asked me, and the baby, how's the baby? That girl may never meet this farmer, but that girl will grow up and know that she's alive because of this Muslim man. And one sees the power of that, maybe not at the moment, but they see it resonate. And in those tiny acts of compassion, one finds a sea of hope. And that's where I find hope, in the particular, in the smallest acts that perhaps the world considers trivial. That's where hope lies for me. Someone talked about despair, and yes, do I despair on the grand issues? Yes. But when I see a story like that, I can't despair. Perhaps it's irrational. Does that change the world? I don't know, but it keeps me going. And when you talk about hope, that act of love, that's the only, finally, for most of us that are relatively powerless, that's what God gives us to fight back. Thank you.